find in your packets, I think it's towards the back, there are 3 pages that should have been stapled together, but the first page of that, the title is Strategic Advocacy, Narrative Framing and Audiences. And there should be 3 pages together, and the final page of that, the 3rd page, has the graphic that's called Spectrum of Allies and Opponents. So I'm going to be going over these pages together. And there was the first there. So to begin with, number 1, what I want to talk about is understanding our strategy for HCAO, how we're going to ultimately win single payer in Oregon, and 2 things that we need to do to win, and why we need to understand our audiences. So first of all, just a quick question out to the whole group. Who do you think is our audience when we're out talking about healthcare? To think about it in kind of an analytical way of 2 different kinds of goals and audiences. First of all, ultimately, since this is about healthcare, both our goals and audiences are always going to be somewhat overlapping, but I think for me it was very helpful thinking strategically about these as separate audiences in many ways. So if you look on that first page, number 1 is understanding our strategy in different audiences and what I call a spectrum of allies and opponents and the corresponding goals for that. So first of all, just to reiterate, to win a ballot measure in Oregon, that means winning 1 million votes throughout the state. And for us to do that, we're going to have to reach people throughout the entire state. If we only show up to groups that invite us to speak that are already friendly audiences, we're not going to quite get to that 1 million vote. So we're going to have to think strategically, not just about speaking, but also seeking particular kind of audiences. And what I want to bring up is this idea of, first of all, the spectrum of allies and opponents. So let's turn to that 3rd page, and you can see that graphic. And I'm drawing a lot here from social movement work, and especially direct action work. And just, as just a background, I teach social studies and history. And basically what I teach my students is that every single positive thing that's happened in the US, and really all over the world, has happened because people have organized. That just like Frederick Douglass has said, power concedes nothing without struggle, right? We need to struggle and demand and organize. We are not going to have single-payer healthcare or so many other things just handed down to us without us organizing. And so in order to do that, our campaign is a little bit different with a ballot measure campaign than a direct action campaign. So if you look at this spectrum here, we could think of our audiences as being active and passive allies. So all of you are basically active allies, right? You believe in our campaign. You've shown up here because you're allies helping us getting the work done to achieve universal health care for all. But we also have really we're a minority right now. Obviously, I mean, if we weren't a minority, we would have won already. We have a huge group in the middle that have never heard of us. Some of them have never heard of single-payer healthcare or don't understand what it is. That is a group that we really need to focus on. And we're going to get to the winning messaging for that this afternoon with what's called the trunk speech. And then we also have our passive opponents and active opponents. And these are people who, for whatever reason, in their belief, worldview, and orientation right now, they are opposed to universal, publicly funded health care for all, or an improved Medicare for all. And what I want to bring up, and actually one other thing I should say is that because this is oriented around direct action, this is a little bit different. Ultimately, we want to, our major goal is to convince 1 million voters to believe in this idea and vote for single payer at the ballot. But we do have a target, even though this is not a direct action campaign. I also hope that we can do some direct action as well outside of public speaking. But our target is basically the main interests that are invested in our current system, that will fight us, that will resist us, and don't want things to change. So who are those groups? Insurance companies, absolutely. They are our main targets. And along with them, I would also say most pharmaceutical companies as well, because they're so tied into our current system of overcharging for medications. So that's what we've seen in both in Oregon in the past with ballot measure 23, in Colorado recently. Those groups and interests will spend a lot of money spreading misleading information to try to defeat us. So we should understand that they are our targets. We're never going to convince them to support what we're doing, because they have something to lose by the majority of us getting something that's really a human right. But what I do want to point out is, among our passive and active opponents, we shouldn't think that we should convince every single, well, who would you guess, besides, ruling out our target, when we're talking about passive and active opponents, what might be an example of a passive or active opponent for us here in Oregon? Yeah. Oh yeah, someone who's opposed to having the government control more about their lives. So obviously, like conservative voters that have that kind of ideology, many Republican voters, yes. Self-insured corporations. Any other? Union members that are tied into the Taft-Hartley plan. So one thing that I want to bring up is we do not need to convince all these passive and active opponents to win. We just need to convince enough. And we need to really focus on this large group in the middle that don't really have a strong opinion against us. They obviously don't have a strong opinion for us either. But I think that's one major group. And when I talk about organizing, this is what I mean by the audience for that. So going back to that first page here, if we think about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, and again, knowing that they are overlapping, we're always doing a little bit of both, and one really reinforces the other. But I just want to explain really simply what mobilizing is. Mobilizing is basically moving our allies to help us move forward in our winning the campaign. So that means in a mobilizing talk, so when you identify an audience that's a friendly audience that are allies, whether they're active or passive allies, your goal really should be, you don't have to spend all your time convincing them that publicly funded universal health care or improved Medicare for all is the solution. They understand the problem, they understand the solution. What you need to focus on is convincing them that we are an organization that could actually win and achieve this. So the kinds of messaging that you're going to have and the goals you're going to have is really different. Really, ultimately, your goal is you want to try to sign up many of them as individual members, if they're not already individual members. You want them to donate money to HCAO, knowing that that money is going to help us win this campaign so that we will all have universal public funded health care. You want them to sign up to volunteer. And so really, instead of focusing on convincing them that what we need is universal health care, you want to convince them that we can win. So, I like to talk about the fact that, I'm really glad that people introduce HR 676 on the national level, but we're really not going to win on that national level first. Look at what happened in Canada. They won in Saskatchewan first, and they showed that something that was controversial, that had some pushback, could actually win, and it set the example for other provinces to want to do the same thing. And we could say the same thing about whether it's gay marriage or about cannabis. We've seen these successes on state levels that spread. And if you think about this size of Oregon, Oregon's population, you could compare our population to the population of Scandinavian countries. If a small country like, Denmark or Norway can have a universal publicly funded healthcare system, Oregon can as well. And especially since we have other allies in other states that are doing this. So anyway, that's what I mean by mobilizing. Mobilizing our existing base to actually do the work to help us win this campaign by 2020. When we're talking about organizing, organizing is really, I think, what most people think about, or what most people think about when you think about publicly speaking for healthcare. I think that's what most people think about, is identifying what our problem is. And a important part of that, as we've all talked about, is telling our personal stories. And identifying what the solution is, right? Informing them. We already have Medicare, a publicly funded insurance system that works, that's much more efficient than private systems. We could improve and expand it to work for all, and it would have enormous benefits, not only for individual people, for healthcare providers, for employers, in so many different ways, for our whole state economy as well. So that's what I mean by having these thinking about these two different kinds of goals, mobilizing goals and organizing goals. And I want us to start thinking about identifying specific groups of people, audiences, that both audiences that invite us to speak and audiences that we should be seeking strategically so that we get that 1 million votes in the state to win, to not only to educate people, but to inoculate them from the misleading messages that we know that people are going to be bombarded with. And with that, I want to go on to the second step, and then you'll have some more time to process and discuss this as well. But let's go just back up just a little bit onto that second page here and say a little bit more before we get to number 2. So if we think about our audiences in terms of the spectrum of shifting people along the spectrum of allies and opponents, we could think of, first of all, not only identifying those specific groups, right, and the kind of goals that we want to have. So that group in the middle, we really want to deliver our organizing talks. And when you're speaking to that kind of group, you want to try to walk away there with expanding our base. So passing out the statements of support, having people sign that, and we will soon be coming up with an electronic version of that, so that speeds up our time, that we don't have to enter that data. But this is how we want to have a goal of being able to reach between 60,000 and 100,000 people in our database that will help spread our messages and talk to their friends, their coworkers, their neighbors, their family that are voters, and convince them that no matter what lies they hear from the millions of dollars in ad campaigns directed against us, that they will vote for universal publicly funded healthcare. And then the next part I want to address, I think this came up in the previous session here, about seeking common ground, and this really ties into what we're about to get to, the second part here. Especially for unfriendly, middle, or passive opponents, it's really important for us to be relational rather than just thinking that all we need to do is just, cite all the facts. A big obstacle for people to really hear our facts are that, they're just so immersed in their whole worldview that they just feel totally alienated from us. And I think this is why telling our personal healthcare stories really open up that door, develop that kind of human connection to people so that people can actually hear some of the facts that we have to share with them. But I think unless we really think about that and ground our public speaking and any kind of speaking in that, we can have the greatest facts in the world and people will just refuse to hear us, and maybe not even refuse to hear us, but actually kind of dig in their heels in their own worldview and beliefs. So this idea, again, comes from direct action organizing, but I think it really applies to what we're trying to do as well. And this is called a narrative insurgency approach. And I'll just read a part of this that you have on the bottom of the second page. In the second paragraph where it says, seek common ground. A narrative insurgency approach, on the other hand, examines that the other's narrative framework examines the other's narrative framework, learning the component parts and looking for points of connection. Rather than directly attacking a creationist whole belief system, for instance, a narrative insurgent looks to foment homegrown insurgency against the most problematic beliefs by identifying ally beliefs and to reinforce them. When speaking to creationists about environmental issues, for example, emphasizing humanity's mandate to care for God's creation can be an effective point of entry. Narrative insurgency's approach, well executed, can be very effective for identifying and drawing out allies. Narrative insurgents do not reject problematic narratives wholesale, but distinguish between those components that are allied, hostile, or neutral to their cause. They embrace as much of a cultural narrative as possible and the allied and neutral components, and encourage the further development of allied components using these as foundations for organizing efforts with and within the given community. So we can think about the different types of audiences. I'm looking at page 3 now, or I guess that's the top or the first of the second sheet. So we can think about 3 different audiences, A, B, and C, and the different kind of goals that we have. So for our choir or our allies, we really want to focus primarily on the mobilizing messages about a winnable campaign and increasing cohesion among our allies and their activity as volunteers and donors. For B, the middle groups are what we need are organizing messages that identify the pressing problem of our current healthcare system and wins them over to the issues about an improved Medicare for all. And then for C, this is probably our smallest group, the skeptics. While we do not address some opponents who we can't change, and I think it would just be frustrating for us to think that we have to change every opposing person's mind, we will need to organize and win over enough rural, conservative, and Republican voters to win by a safe margin to get over 1 million votes. And so think about some key strategic audiences for that. I think some Republican or corporate and business leaders should really be engaged. And right now we have a campaign with a fantastic documentary film that many of you have seen, Fix It, to really look at this from the business point of view and how they can benefit from an improved Medicare for all. So what I would like us to do is to think about this, and we're going to do an exercise in just a moment, but before we get to that exercise, I want you to, it's really kind of taken me some time to come up with a healthcare story. I've been really lucky that I grew up without healthcare. So my parents owned their own small business. We couldn't afford health insurance, and I just never got sick. I mean, my dad was an acupuncturist, and my mom was trained as a nurse in Korea. But I grew up, for, until I went to college for about 11 years without health insurance. So if we had bad luck, if anything happened to us, we would have been totally ruined. So I don't have any compelling healthcare story because I've been really lucky. But for me, I got involved actually with HCAO because as a teacher and a union member, I've seen how much we've struggled with getting proper funding for schools to have class sizes so that teachers don't burn out, so that we can help the students that we really need. And what I found that in our negotiating for contracts, healthcare kept on coming up. The cost of healthcare kept coming up, so that to the point where last year I worked full-time for PPS, our health insurance premiums alone were over $18,000 a year. And the last time we almost went on strike, the first thing that the district said is, we're going to put a cap on how much we contribute to your rising healthcare costs every year. And now let's negotiate about everything else to use that as a bargaining chip over things like class size. So I got really fed up with that. And then actually I'm taking a unpaid leave of absence next year, so I'm going to lose my health care. And so because of ACA, which I'm really glad that we have the expansion of Medicaid, however, under the ACA, I will be required to buy health insurance that I won't be able to afford to use. So I'm going to buy a bronze plan because I'll have to pay, penalty if I don't do that. I'll have to pay over a couple $100s a month, and not a single penny of that coverage will be usable unless I pay $10,000 out of my pocket for a deductible. And so this is not a healthcare plan. And if I don't do this, I will, have to pay thousands in a penalty. And so anyway, so that'll be for the rest of 2016. For 2017, I will have no income. So I will hopefully be able to sign on to OHP. And because of the rest of the year that I come back to teaching, I will just be right under the income limit. But anyway, so that's my healthcare story. But whatever your healthcare story is, I think it takes time. It's taken me time to really think about it. So what I want you to do is just on any piece of paper right now, just draft some ideas for a 2-minute or less healthcare story. And it doesn't have to be like this story I shared. It doesn't have to be about having some, catastrophic health issue in your life, but about how health insurance and concern about health insurance and health coverage for you or your family is a major issue in your lives. And so just jot that down, and then you're going to just take a few minutes to share that with each other. Try to keep it to less than 2 minutes if you can. And in fact, it's really good practice to try to distill it down eventually so that we can tell it in about 1.5 minutes, if not even 1 minute. And I think we get better with practice. It's not something that just comes out naturally. And this is why I want you to just take some quiet time to think and jot down some ideas. And you might, refine it better in the future, but jot down some ideas, and then you're going to take just a few minutes to share among your group.